Per people who have dated rich people, what did you learn? My ex-wife had a grandfather that was a multimillionaire. Christmas time at their house was like being in another world. All of the different family members would try to get a moment with the king and kissed ass as much as possible. I spent my time down on the ground playing with my kids and was happy to get out of there. About a week or two after the second Christmas, I got a phone call from Grandpa. He wanted to know what he could do for my family. I told him I didn't want any of his money, but I would like my kids to know their great-grandfather. Later that year, he showed up at our place unexpected and spent most of the afternoon telling stories with me about his youth. He set up a trust fund for each one of my kids to have their college paid for a little bit after that. He told me out of all of his in-laws, I was the only one that never asked him for anything but to be himself. How real the network, or bubble of it is. It's like the other side from this expensive being poor concept. It's this weird internal community of people with money, and thus power, who are willing to make things happen as long as you're in. I mean, I would meet people at a fundraiser or something and 5 minutes later, they're happy to make a call that will get me a job at some huge firm. Or like, my then boyfriend would say, let's go this concert. Tickets are $180, but it's okay, but a friend's parents have a box, so we'll just join them. Or even one time the dishwasher in our flat broke, but we didn't have to pay a dime for repairs, because his friend from high school's parents owned the building, so they're fixing it for free as a favor. Dated a man who didn't work, lived off of a trust fund. Oddly, since he could afford nearly anything, nothing had any value. He'd buy a $400 KitchenAid mixer and burn it up making Christmas candy the first week. If he decided to make more candy, he'd just go buy another $400 mixer. Nothing meant particularly anything to him. I learned just how productive having money can be. Something needs to be fixed or replaced? We can afford to. Want to do something fun or adventurous? Sure, let's do it now. Want to eat healthier? We can afford all the ingredients. Like, what do you mean your life isn't slowed down by a million different things that need fixing, upgrading, replacing, or saved for? My ex was having problems with roommates at university. Her parents bought a $300,000 condo for her to stay at while she finished her degree. 2 years. They sold it for a profit immediately after. I can't imagine not only being able to solve my problems with money, let alone make more off of them. She also assumed her family was lower middle class because she didn't live in a mansion like her friends. She was very humble and was smart with her money, but it was very clear she could just call her parents if something didn't work out. Meanwhile, my parents were struggling to pay rent, meaning I was their fallback, not the other way around. My wife's family has no concept of what a workday is. My parents and my sister are like this. My dad started his own firm, but for the last 30 years he's been the owner, not the boss. And in the last 20 it's done well enough that he's now minor league wealthy rather than well off. My sister has never worked, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. They will constantly plan family vacations for all of us and be utterly shocked when me and my wife can't just take 3 weeks off to go to Australia with them. But we'll pay. They'll whine, which is lovely. They're very generous and I'm on easy mode because of them, but not understanding that it's not always about the money. They don't really have a concept of how rich they are. My ex-boyfriend was wealthy, but had a complex about how he was super poor. It was because all of his friends were also so wealthy, and he was maybe marginally less rich than some of them. He considered himself on the lower end of the scale. They don't really have a point of reference for how poor some people are. When we were together, I was living on a food budget of £50 a month, and he absolutely could not wrap his head around how a person could spend that little. I lived with a horrendously rich friend. His family are aristocracy in his home country. One thing I've noticed about him is that he's completely incapable of grasping that if I stop working, I just stop being able to eat. He was confused about why I was worried about taking a week off work, and didn't understand I was worried I'd lose money. He seemed to think that most people work because they choose to, because he's never had to work. Grew up poor, now middle class, and at 18 dated a super rich guy. First thing I noticed was the food. Not just quantities, but I also discovered so much food, like oyster, fresh fish, olives, things my parents could never buy. I also had to learn etiquette. My parents brought me up well. I read books all the time, was a decent student and well-behaved kid, but the way his family interacted was so different. I had to learn a lot of unwritten rules that I wasn't aware of. I think in the end what I actually learned was that even though my childhood was rough, the amount of stress of not having enough money has probably impacted me for life. I valued my parents so much more. Once I had seen what life was like for rich people, I was just so proud of my family for making it work with so much less. I had to learn a lot of unwritten rules that I wasn't aware of. Got an examples? mostly related to etiquette, like which cutlery to use at a real fancy restaurant, how to make polite conversation, how to dress for different parties or occasions. Just a lot of stuff I never thought twice about. Like one example was at a restaurant where we got a menu and there were no prices on the menu, so I asked for another one. Turns out women get menus without prices because it's the men that pay, but the moment you ask, everyone knows you don't belong. I was a pretty shy girl, polite and all that, but I always felt out of place because there's so many little things to be aware of. It's very easy to make a faux pas. The difference between having money and having wealth. You grew up poor and worked hard and finally got $10,000 in the bank and your income keeps you afloat? Cool. But that is nothing compared to a 50-acre family farm with a couple houses on it. Several generations of inheritance that will fall in your lap someday. Family business or family connections to lucrative opportunities. Savings, investments, cash hidden in safes, piles of gold jewelry. If they suddenly lost all their checking and savings accounts, they'd still be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and wouldn't have to worry even for a second where their next meal would come from. Spent first 8 years of my adult life with a woman whose parents had money. She had no conception of how hard life could be if you couldn't just sell stocks to buy a new car, or have someone give you a couple thousand to put you up in a new place. She pocketed her paycheck every 2 weeks. When we went out, I paid for gas. I bought dinner. Didn't think much about it at the time because we were engaged. When we broke up, she had $30,000 in her savings account, and I was broke. Growing up with money is like hitting every green light and not having to worry about traffic jams. And it really fucks with your ability to empathize with people. Both of the exceptionally rich men I dated were so out of touch with reality. The detail that sticks out is that one of them just didn't know how to talk about anything else. I'd asked him about movies or books or music, and he had no opinions, and I could tell it made him uncomfortable not to have the upper hand in the conversation. I think he thought I was a pretty simple country girl, and was surprised that I had thoughts and opinions. So he'd fall back on asking me variations of, if money wasn't an issue, what would you? Just for him to say, well, I could make that happen for you. When I answered, got old real fast. Did not take the rejection well at the end of the night. Huge fat baby man. That we're hardly even playing the same game. Never mind by the same rules. I dated a girl from old money, generational inherited wealth, grandpa's money, some corporate bigwig banker or something to that effect. I don't think her father ever worked a day in his life, and her mother clearly came from money as well. Outside of her, I found every one of her family members out of touch and completely unrelatable. I got real good at biting my tongue when my ex's siblings would complain about not getting a new car for their birthday when last year's model is sitting in the driveway. They had no concept of the value of money and never had to do anything for themselves to get what they wanted. I wasn't exactly poor growing up, but for the most part, if it wasn't strictly necessary for survival, I didn't have it. It was really eye-opening how everything was taken for granted. Those specific people would be helpless in the real world if they lost all their dough. Tell me in comments about some stories relating with rich people, how it was. I would love to read it. Thanks for watching and don't forget to watch my other videos. Bye.